Welcome back to episode 3 of the Running Man Self-Regulation Self-Improvement Project podcast. And this is your host, Dr. Armando Dominguez, PhD in health psychology, and also licensed professional counselor and adjunct professor at a local community college. And what I'd like to do today is tell you that what we'll be discussing is speaking in absolutes. Now, this is a self-regulation skill, but also a self-improvement skill that will pay huge dividends in communication with your loved ones, little ones, your peers, your spouse, girlfriend, boyfriend, this sort of thing, or even just with your friends and acquaintances at work. The reason we're going to be talking about this is that most of us don't pay attention to the manner in which we speak, and the manner in which we speak a lot of times shapes and actually develops the kind of communication we're going to have with people, whether it be good, bad, or something that becomes absolutely intolerable. But sometimes the way we speak can be not only offensive, but rather binding to somebody. Could be offensive in a way that we wouldn't understand based on how they interpret the language you're speaking. Not just the words and what they mean. Definitions are absolutely important. And notice I use the term absolutely, and I'm picking on you a little bit because I want us to pay attention to what the word absolute means and then move forward with this idea as a self-regulation skill in the manner in which we speak and also how we speak to others and how people speak to us. Because often things that are very painful or traumatizing or binding to us that make us feel really uncomfortable or even have bad feelings about things have their root in how things are spoken to us. We have our objective world that we experience our environment. Then we have our interpretation of that through the perceptual signals, of course, but then the narrative, the story that we tell each other about our world is a picture painted with the very words that we speak. Now, whenever we speak in absolutes, we're actually using what we would call an exaggeration of terms. Whenever we have an idea of an absolute, here's the example, like the idea of God. If someone were to try to argue for it, argue against it, it's not unlike perfect, something that is beyond our ability to describe and also to argue to the point where we can say it doesn't exist. You can argue all day, but the idea of it is still there. Whenever we use absolutes in speech, we tend to elevate what we're talking about to a level of God level in the sense that you can argue for or against, it doesn't go away. So it exaggerates whatever term we're using that makes it very difficult. And by default can also make someone feel implicated, blamed, or even defined by that term that we're using in an absolute sense. So what do I mean by absolutes? Whenever we're being careful and really speaking factually, not painting a picture or exaggerating or making it sound more compelling or making it sound like I know more or I'm saying something in a way that's going to win me social attention or value or acceptance, then some would say that that would be kind of dry and boring. And that may be the case, but it's not necessarily a truth, but rather an opinion. And what we're not trying to do is use exaggerations, because if this is a self-regulation skill, I would tell you that it would bear you really, really good fruit in the sense that the results are worthwhile. Because it's not just how we speak to each other, but also the recordings of speech that we use when we speak in absolute, sometimes to ourselves, our own self-talk, our internal self-talk, even our external self-talk. Oh, you're always dumb. I always do that. I always mess this up. Notice I'm inflecting with my voice and a little emotion. You're always like this. You're never like that. Everybody does this. Everything, everyone, everywhere, all the time. Terms like always, never, ever, and forever, those are temporal measurements that we'll never be able to, as a human, be able to realize. I'm not going to live long enough to realize an ever or an always or a never or forever, but yet we still use those terms. They create fluidity in language, yes, and they serve a purpose, yes. But when we're discussing self-regulatory skills, things that will enhance your life, things that will cut down on pain in your life, things that will improve communication with your little ones, so that way they don't feel bound or implicated or blamed by default in a way that's inarguable, and you can't erase it from their minds, especially once they take it on from a perspective of authority. Somebody gave it to them that cared for them or that they looked up to, especially somebody that feeds them, clothes them, and makes sure they're safe. That's a lot of power there. So we as adults, even as children, adolescents, and elder folk, we still have to talk with people that speak to us that way, and sometimes using terms in absolute are very colorful and fun to use when we're having fun discussions, but they're very difficult to manage whenever we're trying to undo damage, if you're doing counseling or therapy, or if you're trying to understand why somebody's hurting or upset or offended and trying to figure out why. Sometimes we have to look at, well, what did somebody say? Because our words are used for influence, and the influence is very powerful. So I'm going to use some examples. Whenever we talk to each other, I would encourage you to start with your own self-talk and pay attention to how you talk, but also listen to how people speak to you. And try to be aware that if somebody is using an absolute, it's about influence, and it may not be a nefarious, and I'm trying to manipulate you or do anything that is the common honey of the internet, the narcissist thing. We're not doing that. Most of us are very flippantly speaking without paying attention to what it is that we're doing when we speak. We're just wanting the effect. Whenever we have somebody tell us, you never like this, you always like that, often it's somebody indicating that there's frustration and that they don't prefer this, but it's not done with an insidious idea of trying to create manipulation, but rather encouraging change of anything. So it's not always done with a dark heart. But for improvement of self and improvement of communication, not only with, for instance, coworkers, but especially your little ones, if you have children, speaking to them factually and not burdening them with exaggerations. Can we say that we're lying to them whenever you say you're always like this, never like that? Well, in essence, if you think about it, yeah, kind of. And it's done because we want to create parental influence. Sometimes I've been guilty of this before. I have 3 kiddos myself, and they're adults now, but I really do my best not to. I've really paid attention, trying not to. Doing the absolute speak is uncomfortable for me now, but really trying not to in the past, not to do that, because I was aware of the impact and also the social bind that occurs as a result of trying to parent. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the list of absolute words, so that way we can talk about them as we go. But the temporal ones, always, ever, never, forever, tend to exaggerate that sense of time, and it creates a weight of sorts to what you're speaking to make it sound like what you're saying factually right now has been happening longer than what it has been, but also exaggerates it to a point where it's much larger in concept. So when somebody receives that, think about this. We're painting them a picture, a mental picture with our words. Our words are the paint in the paintbrush that we paint the mental picture or the story that we're writing, speaking in this case, to the person that we're trying to discuss, or in some cases arguing, to be able to get our point across and to win an argument, to create leverage, or to encourage them to come to our side of reasoning, this sort of thing. We're trying to influence, and that's really the bottom line. The other words, everybody's doing this. Nobody does that. Everyone sees what you're doing to create guilt and shame when maybe nobody's looking. When we use things like this, then we're using this social comparative to create weight and shame and guilt in some cases, but also to make it sound like maybe somebody's not normal or outside or set aside from the group and somehow not accepted or running the risk of losing acceptance. There's some implied social qualities there. So using absolutes, it is a method of creating influence, but it's not always done in the best way. Sometimes it can be used for good things, not saying they can't be, but whenever it comes to self-regulation and self-improvement, when we stop speaking to ourselves in absolutes, then we make things reachable. We make goals achievable. We make goals realistic, expectations realistic, and also tangible and doable. Notice what I'm speaking isn't an absolute, but rather relating those to things that are actionable. When we create something like an absolute, oh, it's going to take you forever to do that, when really it might just take a few hours. And I might not like all those hours of work, but it's not forever in comparison. But note the difference whenever we speak them versus 4 hours versus, oh, this is going to take forever. And we have this emotional load that goes with this. And we have to understand that whenever we create emotional load with an absolute, we're creating a compelling quality to the narrative or the picture that we're painting with our words. So what kind of influence am I giving myself when I have self-talk? Mom was right. I'm never going to be any good. I remember when I was young, I was little, and I remember my dad would get frustrated with me, and he really meant no harm by it, but it's just the common colloquial he was speaking in. And when we were little, my mom would make fun of him and say, in Spanish, no sirves para nada is what my dad would say. That means you're not good for anything. He would just get frustrated, toss his hands up, and we're done with you. There wasn't anything wrong being done. We're little kids, but he was just being frustrated. But what was funny is that he was speaking in absolutes, but he wasn't doing it in a nefarious sense, but yet it was spoken. But years later, just going through things, and this is just me being a little self-disclosing, is that I did struggle with that sometimes. What did I say because Dad said that? No, not that. But there's an assumption of information that goes there, where humility versus lack of deservingness, this sort of thing, may have been, in my mind, coupled very closely. And maybe it was something that I struggled with to be able to do more with myself, to achieve more. Almost like I needed acceptance or permission somehow. It was really odd, but it's rather common. But whenever things are spoken that way, and moms and dads do harm unawares sometimes, and not intentionally trying to harm or create a mental block in a child, or even whenever you're speaking with somebody that's a peer or a friend and they say something, it just lands crossways, and here you are in junior high, and 30 years later, you still have the recording of it when something pops up or you've got nothing better to do. So we have to understand that there's an indelible impression that stays with us. What we have to ask is, what's the influence? What does it do? What does it prevent me from doing? And if we speak factually, you may note that we don't always hear things that are flattering or fun or interesting, but they're not the things that remind us of the emotionally inflected absolutes sometimes that we may have heard spoken to us when we were young, or when we were particularly emotionally vulnerable in a stressful situation, or maybe just hearing somebody's opinion of us when maybe they were having a bad day and they were speaking through the inflection of their exhaustion, through their pain, through their discomfort, and not being able to muster some socially comforting tone to their voice that may have created something inadvertently that was uncomfortable to us, or that we kept or carried with us, that has affected us in how we interpret and see things sometimes. So what about absolutes, and how does this help us? Well, when we don't speak in absolutes, we're not exaggerating things, we're keeping things factual. How does this help? By keeping things as factually based or founded in the way we speak, we tend to have less ambiguity, greater understanding, but also we are less apt to get emotionally charged about something if someone tells us something factually, versus, when you did this, that I got upset and it really pissed me off kind of delivery, where it becomes personal, but also argumentative and maybe even a little adversarial. And it sets us aside and maybe even causes us to have an emotional reaction, or maybe even mirror their reaction, which means I'm no longer responding mindfully, and I'm in a state of almost like pre-vigilance. Heart rate goes up, especially if we're shocked, or if someone says things in a way that they're threatening, or maybe they're physically intimidating just by virtue of size, not because of behavior. And that's enough. And we will start assuming things. We start making sense of things because our narrative maker, our storyteller, our seer sees. Unless one is congenitally blind, our seer sees. We have the largest number of neurons that is set aside for visual perception because 95%, I believe, of the information we take in is visual first. Everything else is after or less than that. And that's a huge amount. So what does that have to do with speaking in absolutes? Well, what our seer sees, our believer believes, kind of like the cardboard cutout of a Dallas Cowboy cheerleader, for instance, at a mom and pop grocery store. You walk up to it, it looks pretty real, but then you walk to the side, realize, wow, that's just cardboard. It's just a really good picture. And it's compelling and it's believable. And whenever we are perceptually dominant, that means we're in stress and we're paying attention to what's going on. If we're mirroring because of somebody's verbiage or their body language, we tend to be more apt to believe what it is that's going on. And if we don't know what's happening, we tend to paint a story defaulting to protect self. And we tend to have a negative attribution to the situation or the environment because we want to make sure we're safe first. And that might not be the case. That may not have been what was intended. But if somebody says things very suddenly, very loudly, and inflects with body language and tonal, then we could very well get into something that's exceedingly uncomfortable. And for the most part, we may be misinterpreting it, not looking at things the way they are factually, but rather how we assume them to be. And we'll be speaking about assumptions and assumption of safety in the next podcast, because these are very closely coupled, but very important. So back to speaking in absolutes. Whenever we speak in absolutes, we're painting a picture, kind of like a car salesman telling you about that Volkswagen with no engine with 3 wheels. It's yellow and it's a lemon car. Yes, and it even resembles a lemon, mind you. But it's the best car you'll ever have, and you'll never have to change the oil. Of course, it has no engine. But whenever we're using salesman speak, we're getting people to buy into an idea. Truth or not, doesn't matter. And that's influence, and it's not always for the best. So we have to be very careful in the way we speak. And my encouragement to you as an exercise is pay attention to whenever your self-speak, your self-talk is going on. Do you use terms like always? Oh, you're never like this. I'm always like that. Oh, I'm so dumb. I'm always dumb. I always get these wrong. Things like this. If that's the case, then try to catch yourself and start to say, okay, I know that I say that, but I'm really not like that. Or, well, I feel dumb right now, but, and it's okay to feel dumb once in a while. It's okay to say, well, I don't feel so smart right now. That's all right. But to say it in a manner that is absolute always. I'm never like this, or Mom was right. I'm never going to get this. Or we're saying things habitually. I'll never get this. That's too hard. How can I ever expect to do that? Notice how big the picture seems almost insurmountable and outside of my reach as a human being. So be careful in the way you speak to yourself, because this has a lot to do with how successful you are at applying social skills, but also in self-improvement of any sort. And if you really want to believe in yourself, often you have to stop speaking to yourself in absolutes and talking to yourself in factuals, in base facts. Just the facts, ma'am? Of course. I prefer it that way, because when it gets emotional and when it gets opinionated, we get interpretations and often incorrect. You know what the gossip mill does, right? People say things, someone comes in, they're emotional. Hey, did you hear that so-and-so did this, that, and whatever? Or did you see this? Somebody was running up and down the street with a flag and they weren't. And the tone that's delivered often is what's listened to and gets our attention. That's an alarm reaction from whenever we were cave people, more than likely. When there was that emotional load and we had to go and check, and if it didn't pan out, okay, so it was wrong. But nobody goes back and corrects those things whenever it's a social thing or whenever someone is telling you something that affects how you think about yourself or how you do. We have to be willing to be accountable and responsible for how we speak to each other and how we're spoken to. And sometimes encouraging people to, hey, hold on, tell me the facts. What happened? How do we stay in the absolute and the factual? By doing these things. And I'll line this out for you. Ask what? Ask where? Ask when? Ask who? Who's involved? You can ask how. The very last thing is not asking why, but rather don't ask why. If you ask the what, the where, the who, the when, and the how, the why will become evident, and you'll realize that if you ask why, that one's emotional, opinionated self starts jumping in, and we start getting into this perpetual loop, and we won't be able to get those other facts to be able to be helpful if we're trying to help someone, or to get to the bottom of what it is someone is telling us. And sometimes we need to do that, because without that, we get stuck in that loop and then walk away wondering, what did they say? Maybe even forgetting, because we're trying to make sense of words that are describing emotions and feelings about stuff versus the stuff that we should have been talking about, which is the what's, the where's, the when's, the how's, and the who's, and that sort of thing. So as an exercise, work on paying attention to, well, how do I speak to myself? Do I speak to myself in absolutes? Am I always like this? Am I never like that? Is it really me telling myself or someone telling me everybody does this? It's everything, everywhere, all the time, everyone. If we speak like that, then we're speaking very broadly, very flippantly, and without care. And sometimes we have to be a little more precise in our speech to be able to not only self-regulate, but also to self-improve in all areas that we want to apply ourselves in. Because all areas that we want to apply ourselves in require good communication. The best communication is fact-based, not opinion-based, and it's not emotionally spoken, but one that's done with control. So keeping these things in mind, once again, ask the what's, the where's, the when's, the how's, and the who's. Don't ask why. And if you ask why first, you're derailing your best communication. And this works really well with kiddos, because if you start teaching this to them young, they start developing really good critical thinking skills at a younger age. And they start trying to figure stuff out. It's a really encouraging thing. And if you didn't get it when you were younger, that's okay. Get it now. If you've gotten some of them, this shouldn't be a surprise. If you've gotten all of them but choose not to use them, well, can't really say much about that. But most of us have used these at some point in time. It's not anything new, but it is important to be able to try to use them more effectively, more frequently in our lives, so we can develop, or rather encourage, higher quality things in our lives in higher quantities. And much of the things that we have in our life are interactions with people. Think about how these can help you improve the quality of the communication that you have and the relationships you have, and also the ones that you will have in the future. So that's going to be about it for episode 3. Not through, but 3. I've done this twice already. And I just want to tell you thank you for listening and paying attention. A number of the skills that we'll be covering in the future, I'm going to ask you to just go and give some commentary on the bottom if any of your experiences have been either positive or negative or neutral involving these skills, or maybe even some things that you've noted going through your life. Let me know. But I'd really like to hear from you, and let me know how things are going. In the future, we have some things lined out as far as projects that we're going to be putting out in video as well. And I hope to hear from you soon. And certainly, if you have the opportunity, we want you to subscribe and like, and let us know how things are going. And for right now, it's been really good talking to you. More self-regulation skills on the way. And I appreciate your time. Certainly great talking to you once again. This is Dr. Armando Dominguez signing out. And all the best.